Hello everyone, and thank you for joining me on another episode of Sitting Down with Scholars. I'm joined by Liz, and Liz, can you start off by telling myself and my guest about your academic journey so far?
Yeah, thank you for having me here, Jordan. So I started off my research career. My undergraduate was in geology, and that opened my world to everything, everything below the surface. So that's everything from the volcanics to the sedimentary. But I fell in love with paleontology at university, and won the Paleontological Association prize during my undergrad. Then I went and did a master's in paleobiology at the University of Bristol. My undergraduate degree was at the University of Edinburgh, and I did a thesis on the a biomechanical analysis of the biting force of the saber-toothed cat Smilodon fatalis, because I love the intersection between all the different disciplines, because nothing exists in isolation. Everything is connected. And initially, I planned to go down sort of the macro paleo route, but I had the most incredible professor at the University of Bristol, Dr. Daniela Schmidt, and her discipline were microfossils. Well, not micro, well, yeah, not nanofossils, microfossils, all about foraminifera and plankton. And to discover that something so small has such a fundamental impact on the entire world, and they are so beautiful, just enthralled me. Now, my plan was to do a PhD with Daniela, but I'm from the Channel Islands. And back then, Channel Island students weren't international students, but we also weren't considered UK students. So I was not eligible for any NERC funding, which meant that ironically, I ended up in Germany, because the EU did allow Channel Island students to be eligible for funding. So I went to the Alfred Wegener Institute for Polar and Marine Forschung, Polar and Marine Science, to do an interdisciplinary PhD on the Delta Carbon 13 isotopic signature in the Southern Ocean. And the reason that's interesting is because if it was an unusual signature in both the North and the South Pole, it would tell us clearly that that is a temperature-controlled isotopic anomaly, but this only occurs in the Southern Ocean. Now, I didn't complete my PhD in the end for various reasons, including that I didn't speak German when I went to Germany, and although I was doing my PhD in English, I completely underestimated how important and how much time it would take to reach a decent level of fluency with German. I am so grateful for the experience, though, because it was during my time in Germany, being for several years the only native English speaker at my institute, that I discovered that actually what I'm really interested in is science communication, not research. I'm quite an indifferent researcher. I love editing scientific papers, and I love fieldwork. I absolutely adore fieldwork. But the hard bit, the doing all of your lab experiments and your analysis, yeah, that's not where my interests lie. And I'd much rather take someone else's preprint paper. They've done all the hard work, they've baked the cake, and then I get to put the icing on it by tidying it up and making it really readable. And it really frustrated me during my time in research that how inaccessible a lot of scientific papers are. Now, there's a huge change. I find modern ones so much easier to write. We are definitely moving away from that passive voice. And I think that's so important, because actually science should be for everybody. So now I am completely in science communication and documentary making and film and having a tiny social media presence. And I am so much happier there.
Before we go down more the science communication path and thinking more specifically, what then is your typical day as a science communicator? Because I know for many people who are probably thinking, "Oh, I'd be really interested in going down something in that route myself." What does that look like for a layperson to imagine?
That is a really good question, because for many science communicators, including myself, this is not my full-time job. You have to be really established to get to a position where you can live on the money you make from science communication. So I do consultancy work, I do outreach, education. I also work for Organisation Cetacea, Orca, who put science communicators on ferries and cruise ships to collect data about cetaceans, whales, dolphins, and porpoises. So I spend quite a bit of time actually at sea collecting data and also giving lectures and doing education. And yeah, I do private consultancy stuff, and I've got like, I'm not going to say boring. I've got a small admin job that I do remotely as well, so that I actually can pay my bills day to day. It'd be lovely to fund my entire life through science communication, but I'm certainly nowhere near that stage. So very varied is the answer.
Okay, that's interesting. And from a lecturing point of view, is that lecturing online or in the Channel Islands? And how does that work? And do you have any international lectures that you? I'm mindful that from a chat with the Channel Island being detached from the mainland of the UK, asking you if you lecture internationally is probably more of an obvious question, but hopefully.
So when I work for Orca, the lectures are actually on the cruise ships and ferries to the guests. And so they're much more general science level lectures. I really love doing proper scientific lectures, but I haven't really done many of those since I left research. And when I was a PhD student, it always baffled me that other students weren't super keen on giving lectures at conferences, because as far as I was concerned, that was the best part of conferences. I love lecturing. It is my top three favorite things in the world to do. So I am not currently doing any online lectures. I did quite a few during the pandemic, but I have not recorded any of them because that was really well organized. But I definitely want to start doing lectures again online because I really enjoy it. Although I find it can be quite challenging because everyone turns their cameras off. So you are effectively lecturing to yourself, and it's a bit bizarre. You don't get the feedback from an audience that you do if you're doing it in person.
Do you find with that particularly, and I'm thinking from when I've lectured during the pandemic myself for college students, it's not necessarily lecturing to a blank screen that's the off-putting thing, it's lecturing to your own face that is the off-putting thing, or that's what I personally used to find. Uh, Talking to the abyss is fine, but talking to yourself, yeah.
And you become hyper aware of little facial movements, and you're like, why do I twitch my nose like that? I never realized that I like have a downward smile. And yeah, it's very bizarre, isn't it?
No, it definitely is. And one of the things that I want to circle back around to, Liz, is thinking more about the type of content that you're creating and the type of information you're conveying with your work. Is what are you? What area of the natural world would you say is your core, not bread and butter, but your core focus, your passion area?
You have hit on something that I really actually need to define, because one of my biggest strengths and also weaknesses is that I find everything interesting. And as soon as I learn something new, I get a little bit obsessive in my research. But actually, particularly on social media, we do need to have our box, like what our core thing is. And when I started out, it was very much Guernsey. So we are a tiny island, and there is so much wildlife here. And it's kind of forgotten. We are an urban island. It's 24 square miles, 60 square kilometers, and there's over 60,000 people here. So the population density is really high. And despite this, we have more than 14,000 documented species. but people always say, well, we don't need to worry about Guernsey because there's nothing here. Well, there is. So it's particularly during the pandemic that to raise people's spirits, I started posting about different bits of Guernsey's wildlife. So that is still a core focus. But as I said, I find everything interesting. And what I think I need to do, and I'm not there yet, is actually have a much more regular schedule. So maybe Guernsey stuff is on a Wednesday, whales and dolphins, which are my main focus of research, I guess, at the moment, be on like a Monday for Marine Monday or a Friday for, I don't know, Fantastic Friday, and then have something else another day of the week. And I'm not there. But that would be my bit of advice to anyone starting out. Work out what you are doing, because otherwise no one will know what you're about, and search engines and social media won't know how to index you, and that can make it much more difficult to grow your following.
No, I would completely echo that. And I know from my own perspective, I tend to try to focus on education research. I mean, there are times when I talk about different things to different people, and I would say, broadly interested in, similar to yourself, a lot of different areas, because education tends to fall into policy, and particularly for those who are, let's say, less aware of just how impacted that various pieces of policy can have on the individual, the family, and therefore wider society. But one of the things, and again, my motivation for doing things like this was, I felt I was really passionate, both in my teaching experience and in my science communication experience, of talking about other people's academic journeys, improving representation of science, and that's where this idea was born of, and a lot of like Scholar Sundays and so on, purely to try to promote that line of communication. And wanting to stay with that thread a bit on inspiration, was it? I know for many of us, we can think of individuals who represent us and who potentially inspire us, but was there anyone who really inspired you to be who you are today?
That's a really difficult question, because on some level, every single person that is a part of your life for a length of time will have an impact on you and shape who you are today. And for some of those people, I've learnt, I'd say, just as much from people that have had, I don't want to say negative, but who my experience with has been quite challenging, as those that have been cheerleaders, because sometimes you do need someone to give you critical feedback, and they might not do it in a nice way, but then the lessons from that stick with you. Um, so I, when I left research, I worked in finance for a little bit, and I was not a good fit for finance, because I went from an environment where no one cared when you were in, as long as the work got done. And you know, if you, the only time to get the mass spectrometer was overnight, then you'd work overnight, and no one cared. And then to go to an environment where you must be at your desk ready to work at 9 a.m., I could not get my head around that concept. And I had quite a negative experience. But what it taught me was that I was not listening, because you know, it wasn't important. I wasn't a front office member of staff, so it's not important. But it was important to that team, and I wasn't listening. So that taught me a lot. I had an amazing English literature teacher when I was at school, because I never saw the point in English literature, particularly not the set texts we had. And my teacher really opened my mind to different viewpoints are valid, and you cannot judge someone on your experience. Their experience is really different. So the book in question was Jane Eyre, and it really annoyed me. And I thought that she was ridiculous for pining after this married man, and it didn't matter that his wife was insane. So I think, there's so many people. Like, as I said, Daniela at the University of Bristol, my paleontology lecturer at the University of Edinburgh, my igneous petrology lecturer at the University of Edinburgh, Dr. Godfrey Fitton, because Geology, a lot of the minerals, we actually use their Latin names, and the Latin tells us what the mineral is. Now, I hated Latin at school. I didn't like it. I didn't see the point. It was a dead language. What was the point? Who cares? I'm not going to try. And it wasn't until I was at university and learning from Godfrey things like plagioclase means dual twinning, which literally is what the mineral does under a microscope. You get the black and white twin. And then going, oh, I'm an idiot. I could be learning so much more about everything if I just knew the Latin. And that's, I mean, and that's why we use Latin, because it's a dead language. So I could talk to a colleague in Portugal and we would have different common names for the sperm whale, but we're going to use the same Latin name. So actually, even if we can't speak each other's language, we can still communicate. Yet so many people, that's not a
No, I think that's a fair point. And like you say, I think when taking lessons from various different people and how they shape your experiences, particularly as educators, I think that's a really important way of doing it. And it's interesting to see that yourself and different people don't go with I would say, the typical of inspired by a particular scientist or researcher that is more abstract, and it's more of in an applied setting where we tend to see teachers, uh, academics, supervisors. And I think it's so powerful what those relationships can be to shape your academic journey and how that defines your career overall. I think that's really something that is taken for granted in terms of how things are taught, where we view very much more content rather than context, and who is the individual representing that context is often lost in the translation. Especially, I think, when we talk about things like how AI will replace teachers, you can't get the soul of what is there from something from an abstract computer. You need the lived experience of someone who's lived it and talked about it. And don't get me wrong, some people can have a fascinating story, but can be absolutely dreadful at communicating it, and that is a skill. The importance of recognizing that skill is also there. The other thing I just wanted to highlight is one of the other things about English literature and how it's taught brings up that point, and it came up with my previous guests in a conversation, and we were saying that there was certain modules and subjects that we came back to far later in our academic journey and saw the value of once we saw the context and the relevance of it. In my case, I use art and artifacts in my study, and that didn't become valuable till I knew how it could be utilized in more of a scientific research setting. Whereas how it was taught, sketch a ball. Why am I sketching the ball? What is the point to this? I'm not learning about the history of it. I'm not learning about the culture. I'm just learning how to sketch, and what is that teaching me? So it's interesting to hear that concept from. I know the anthology was a particular pain in my life when I was going through English language and so on at GCSE, and it's that for me, certain things like that, how we assess more the humanities subjects is, I wouldn't say necessarily the best to getting the most out of them, but especially people who aren't really interested in them.
I agree. And actually, I think it is the way we treat the humanities is appalling, because communication and art is the soul of humanity. And then we go, oh, actually, it's not important. The sciences are important. But can you really be a good scientist without creativity? And the arts and the humanities bring that creativity. And what you pointed out about art, if I look online, I could read the most amazing scientific paper, but if it is just tabulated data, it's going to be a slog. An amazing infographic is going to capture my attention, and it's also going to help me understand it much better. And I really think in the pandemic, it became really clear that some amazing scientists are rubbish communicators. And I think we really do need to move towards STEAM. So science, technology, engineering, art, and mathematics, because STEM can make amazing science, but if it's only being accessed by 20 people in the world, I think we failed. whereas art makes everything accessible.
No, completely, 100%. I would, without a shadow of a doubt, agree with that. And that, I suppose, brings me on to something that I think is really important for any educator and communicator like yourself, is your impact. What is that impact that you hope to achieve? What do you hope to do with your work?
This is always difficult to answer because what I want is I want people, even one person who has felt that science is not accessible or for them, to actually discover the joy of science. And I do this through sort of the natural world because that's what I know the most about and it's easy to get excited about nature, I think, because something you said earlier, it was about representation and highlighting different voices. And I think that's key. We need to see people that look like us, that remind us that we can go, oh, I can see a woman being successful, or I can see someone of my religion being successful, or my ethnicity being successful. And historically, we have been really, really bad at that. And I think we still aren't great. And so I have ADHD, so that's autism and ADHD. And I want to be visible so that someone else who might have been dismissed because of their disability realizes that actually it is for, yeah, I want other people to find the joy because when we learn and we discover new things, we will sparkle. And yeah, I'm not looking for a big impact. I just want other people to find joy in our world.
I think it's interesting though. One of the things I really like, and one of the things I've spoken about great length with different education policies on, like LSAs, and the importance of like learning support assistance and so on. And one of the reasons for that is I'm very much now on the qualitative side of it. You can't necessarily always measure something, but it does have a profound impact. You just have to necessarily, or you have to really go looking for it in terms of what that information is. If you get, you can't put an exact figure on it, but it has merit. And one of the reasons for that, and why my thought process when you said about it is, one, we don't tend to like to associate ourselves with what we see as distinguishable features, or features that are generally, let's say, with a negative connotation to them. We tend to try to distance ourselves from it. So I have dyspraxia. I've always talked about dyspraxia. I'm very much someone who will talk about my experience and what I hope to have an impact with as someone who is neurodiverse, because I think it's important to give that representation. But I know a number of people who won't talk about it because they fear, oh, that might put recruiters off, that might limit different things. The same as some people won't go on social media because they feel like, well, that might hinder my recruitment process. And yes, it might. And yes, there are cases of that. My view, rightly or wrongly, I've always looked at, well, would I want to work with someone that doesn't want me to be my authentic self? Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying anything that yourself or I speak about is particularly controversial, but it should be. I want to be. I think in today's working world, I think you have to be your authentic self because of that's your brand. That's who you are. That's especially in the likes of academia, universities, education. I think that's going to become more important rather than less important as the time goes on. But I do think that qualitative, who we are, what we do, why we do it, and that connection that it can have with people. Because I think otherwise, if if either of us were purely the sum of our qualifications and the institutions we worked at, I think it would be such a misgiving to only present that side of your achievements, your accomplishments, rather than who you are and what you intend to do. But yeah, it was really interesting as well to think about it from the point of view of uh, giving back, not through. Very few people I've heard who have spoken to me on sitting down with scholars have very reluctantly, I would say, mention things like achievements, awards, and so on. It tends to be giving back to my community, educating the next generation, inspiring someone to go and do something different, hopefully contributing in some way so someone else picks up their work at some point. That's the focus. What I would say are the less measured parts of academia or research or education, rather than the more obvious ones such as the awards, the medals.
Yeah, I think part of it is that when we receive awards and achievements, they are something that we celebrate in the moment. But as you say, that's not who we are. And I think most of us will acknowledge that even when we work hard for awards, etc., and we do, don't get me wrong, we are, I think all of us are aware that we all benefit from luck. So sometimes it might just be that you were at the right institution at the right time and you met the right scientist and you had this opportunity. And so I don't tend to talk about awards and things because I am really aware that luck has played a huge part. And I don't want to give a false impression to people that I am this amazing person because, I mean, I think we all are, but luck's so critical. It's right place, right time. And yes, we need the hard work, but if we then talk about the actual impact we're having on people, that is something that is so much more powerful. So I volunteer for a youth group, and there is a young person there who is doing something very much out of their comfort zone with this nature club. And they gave feedback recently that said, I really enjoyed this week. I wasn't bored once. Now that for me is much more valuable than any award I've ever won, because this is someone who is finding their joy and they are becoming engaged, and seeing that change is so much better. It's so much better than a piece of paper with a little stamp. Woohoo! I've got an award. So yeah, I think maybe that's why we all talk about these more intangible.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think it's also the point that when we think about, I just say I completely agree with the luck side of it. But the other thing that really stands out to me generally is a lot of it is perseverance, a bit of luck, a bit of perseverance, and the smaller element of the ability. Because to me, I don't know, half of the opportunities I've had, if you take the several hits or knocks and you keep going, if you keep going, generally something turns up. Sounds like a really bad cliche to say, oh yeah, just keep going, just keep hammering away. But yeah, for the most part, that is how the system tends to work. I think I can remember when in my undergrad I was applying for the job, that first job after my undergrad. I think must have applied for probably 40, 50 positions. Sorry, not on my undergrad, my placement, and placement year. Applied for near on 40 places, probably interviewed for five. And then in the end of those uh, five places, the scholarship, the more prestigious award, so to speak, was associated with a role that I did get, but it was something that was more a surprising point to get it because it was purely by continuing to go forward and keep going that it actually came about. And I would completely agree with the luck and the luck and the perseverance side, because without both of them, the ability would certainly not have come in there. But now, as you add to that, it makes you look like the tip of the iceberg is what everyone sees that your progress. It looks like, oh, they're fantastic. There's a lot under that iceberg that is gone on, the amount of rejections, the things that you put in that you get. And I think we don't talk about the failings as much as we talk about successes. And I think most people don't necessarily brag about the successes, but they still don't talk about the failings enough.
Yeah, we don't talk about failure enough, and I think we should talk about it more.
One of the things I wanted to ask you, Liz, is what, based on what you do now and in the many hats that you wear, what is it that really excites you? I know you talked about a part of this in the impact side. But what is it that really excites you about what you do, or why do you do it?
Because I learn something new every day. And I am so fortunate that everything I learn effectively opens a new door or window. So we've just finished doing a film about pollinators. And as part of that, I've learned so much from a local pollinator scientist, Dr. Miranda Bain. And I I always used to say that entomologists were born, not made. But now I've changed my mind because we spent a year doing this film, and the insect world is a kaleidoscope of chaos and wonder and the most unbelievable things happening. And I would never have learnt that if we hadn't done this film. I might have done a few videos about bees and things, or, oh, this is a really cool moth. This parasitoid fly predates on this moth. But I really wouldn't have learnt half of the intricate world that's going on right beneath our feet. So for me, it's always learning. And through learning, I meet new people and I learn new things from them. I think that's my favourite bit. Just always learning. And you never know what or from where.
It's interesting to hear, though, and as someone who is I keep honeybees. So one of the things that I've learned from that experience, and particularly the sympathy that I have for beekeepers in the Channel Islands, is you also have the invasive species of the Asian hornet. And how that affects the ecosystem, and that's something from that point. Just pull out that particular point of interest from my own perspective. I'd love to know more about how the impact on pollinators have been from the fact that you have the invasive, they're a very invasive predator.
I'm so glad you brought this up, because this is one of the reasons why islands are so cool, because they're each their own separate ecosystem, and all the Channel Islands have experienced the invasive Asian hornets, but they have adopted different strategies to deal with them. So Jersey adopted a strategy of, we're not going to do anything, and we'll just control the nests once they're here. Whereas Guernsey, the bailiwick of Guernsey, which is actually an archipelago of islands, adopted for a different approach, which is, we are going to exterminate every single nest we find. We are going to try and stop this species becoming established. And so far we have been successful. Now, although it's expensive, it is much cheaper than allowing the species to become established. But also it provides innovative scientific research, because the way this species is behaving on islands means that we can compare the two islands. Now, we used to believe that this species was territorial, but we can see from France, and we're seeing it replicated here, that actually these hornet queens will share territories. They will nest in close proximity, which can have a much greater impact on the ecosystem, because you don't get the saturation that you would if they had distinct territories. Another bit of science that has now been debunked, or debunked's not the right word, we've learnt more, is that the standard scientific belief, oh, that's a terrible sentence. The science was that they would go for the preferential environments first, and they would only start colonizing marginal environments once those preferential environments were saturated. So tall trees, preferential. In a bush or a wall or a bank was not a preferred site. But in Guernsey, we're eradicating the nests. And one year we couldn't find a nest. And it was because this queen had built her nest in a stone wall. But there was all of this unused preferential habitat. So we've learned that actually what we thought about their habitat preferences was wrong. We've also seen different years where there have been different prevailing winds, and that has affected the number of queens that have been able to arrive. In one case, we had a queen that had made it all the way to shore, and then she literally died of exhaustion on the shore. Now, whether we'll be able to stop this species from establishing long term, I don't know. But we are being successful at the moment. And everything we've learnt here in both Jersey and Guernsey means that beekeepers and scientists and appropriate authorities in the UK are actually being trained, because we're effectively the front line of defence. So everything we've learned is benefiting the UK. And one last point, sorry, I kind of got on my soapbox here. Recently, so there's a nest that they're still trying to track down. And so we've had bait stations in 500 metre squares all across the island. So there's a bait station in each of these squares. And there's a nest in near one of these bait stations. And we know that it's a secondary nest. So the primary nests are really, really small. It's queen and the initial workers, and then they abandon that and go make a secondary nest. And you want to get that before the end of summer, because that could potentially have 6,000 queens by the end of the summer. And that nest will have workers. So there are worker hornets visiting this bait station. So we went to film there, and the other insects are feeding on the outside of the bait station. It's been designed so that hopefully you don't get other insects trapped inside. And when this hornet came into, it was really regular, so every 15, 20 minutes. And when it came into the garden, the sound of the bumblebees changed. You could hear their buzz change. It got lower, it got aggressive. It was deeply unhappy. And yes, I am anthropomorphizing a bit, but you could hear that change. And if there was one bumblebee on the bait station, the hornet would just shoo it away. But when there were 3 or 4, it might be able to bump them off, but the bees were coming back. And I don't know enough about honeybees. I'm sure I read some research that they're starting to, in France, that they're starting to learn how the hornets are raiding the hives. But I can't remember where I read it. But it does indicate that actually our native species may be adapting. I mean, it's still awful, and the ecological impact is incalculable. I would say less so for our honeybees, because we have the beekeepers, we have the hives. It's things like solitary bees that have no protection that I'm concerned about. I'm concerned that the ecological impact is going to be hidden until it's too late.
It's interesting as well with, I think, like you say, different species of bees, solitary bees, both our native hornets, yellow jackets, and the European hornet as well, how they're coping with it. I know I'm quite interested in, from a behavior point of view, the Iberian bee, because they're far more defensive, and the Asian honeybee is, they have a very different strategy in terms of how they apply. The problem, I think, with honeybees is a lot of what would potentially be an adaptation they would gain, because of other selective breeding practices, the potential limitations there would also be a trade-off. But I completely agree. In the natural world, that'd be very much a challenge. But whilst I could talk about honeybees and so on for quite some time, and just being mindful of how long I've got you for in this interview, Liz, is let's move into the telling your story in 10 words or less segment. So can you start off by telling me, what did you want to be when you were younger?
An oceanographer, which I became, and then realised that actually I didn't want to do research, and I wasn't a great researcher. But yeah.
Unlike a lot of my guests who are still very much a perspective of that, it's good to hear that you got to that point with that, and even if you did change your field at some point, which I will also highlight that most people, I think, is it 2 career changes that most people go through in their lifetime, from what I've heard. But next question: how do you want other people to see you?
I don't know. that's a real cop out. I would hope that people would see me as someone approachable, helpful, and if I don't have the expertise they need, that I can point them towards someone who does. But I've never really thought about it that much, if that makes sense.
No, that does make sense. And next question is, can you describe your field or work in 10 words or less?
Field work obsessed, oceanographer turned science communicator who finds everything interesting.
And what do you think is the biggest challenge in your field? And just to caveat with that, what do you think is the biggest challenge in science communication?
Lack of diversity.
And I do just want to pull up on that one. Is that diversity of the individuals there in your view, or diversity of thought?
Oh, I can expand. I think particularly social media algorithms prioritize white presenting people and Western communicators in English.
And like you say, your response was perfectly clear. It's more just from an area of personal interest, just wanted to probe that one a bit more. And do you then think is a surprising fact that most people would not be aware about you that you would like to share?
Well, I haven't told many people that I am that I'm ADHD, ADHD and autistic. Going back to an earlier question, we were talking about people wanting to have a certain level of anonymity online and finding our niche. And I've seen people really blow up, but then they've been pigeonholed. And one thing I didn't want to do was become someone that was just talking about ADHD and autism, because my experience is my experience. And I have been exceptionally fortunate, again, talking about luck, that my family is incredibly supportive. And I never had to face discrimination from my family. I mean, I didn't get diagnosed until I wasn't making progress with my PhD and I couldn't work out why. And it was because I was undiagnosed. And I really want to be a science communicator talking about nature and how everything is cool. I don't want to be talking about having ADHD and autism, because there are so many people out there doing a much better job in that respect than I ever could. But I think I have reached a stage where, as you said before, we need to be authentic. So yeah, I guess that's the thing some people might not know about me.
Well, hopefully, I look forward to seeing more conversations about that from you, Liz, as well, because it'd be certainly interesting to hear your own, like you say, your own personal story on that one. But that's the end of the telling your story in 10 words or less, and just being a bit mindful of, unfortunately, having to limit the segments to an hour. Is what do you want your legacy to be? Either personal, academic, however you want to take that.
I have never thought about my legacy, if I'm brutally honest, because that's not why I'm doing anything. I think if I had any legacy, it would be just that I helped people, that I supported people and gave people who'd felt left out or left behind the courage and confidence to actually, oh, this sounds really trite, follow their dreams. Because so many people don't grasp what they're really good at or what they love because they are so worried about failure. And that sort of brings me back to I should talk about failure more, because there's been a lot of failure in my life and we learn the most from our failure, and we need to normalize talking about failure and not being ashamed of it.
Now, I would definitely agree. I would certainly say I probably need to do more of the same, talking about the failures a bit more and humanizing that as well, because like you say, we don't talk about it enough. And even though everyone knows, we learn more from it. So on the flip of legacy, how do you feel that your heritage has shaped who you became? And I always put the caveat here, that can be academic heritage or personal heritage.
In my family, the first child went to university and became a doctor. And my father did that, but he really wanted to be a physicist. But the family pressure was such that he went and became a doctor, and he was an amazing doctor. He's retired now, but he was incredible. And he was really insistent that we did that me and my brothers, that we did what we wanted. And there was never any pressure from my family for me to become a doctor. I do remember being, about 7 and someone asking me if I was going to be a doctor like my dad. And I was like, no, I'm going to be an oceanographer. Why would I be a doctor? But I think that has really shaped me. that I wasn't forced to go down a certain route. And I have friends and compatriots who were forced down that route, and friends whose achievements were almost belittled because they were female. And so their brothers' achievements were held as more impressive than theirs, even though they weren't. They were different achievements. So I actually think a lot of what I've achieved is because I had a family that were like, you can go and do it, and judged everything that all of us did equally and of equal worth.
I think that's a very commendable position, and like you say, I've heard similar stories from different people where they highlight that either societal or family pressure can unfortunately shape their academic journey in a different way, where they don't feel like they're the captain of their own ship steering their journey, and instead they're more of a passenger going through life, which is a quite a unfortunate way of looking if you think of that's the some of how you be. But from that perspective, I'm thinking about the next generation, people who are going through that. Is there any piece of advice that you would give to someone who's just starting out in any way, shape, or form?
Be kind to yourself. What you do now, what you do in the next 10 years may not be what you're doing 20 years from now. People will go through more and more career changes. It is much harder for this younger generation. Any adult that says the younger generation has it easy is talking complete mince. It is so much harder. So on that note, try as many things as you can, particularly when you're young, before you've left school, or if you go to university, try lots of different clubs. Try things and see if you like it. And if you don't, then stop it, drop it. The whole point, try and do all of these different things, because you never know what you might discover you have an aptitude for. I mean, I did drama at school, and I actually think I dropped it in the end, but I actually think it's made me a much better lecturer, learning about pacing, emphasis, all of those things. So even though I didn't go down the art route, I think that has massively helped me in my career. And if you try all these things at school and at university, you can try them a lot cheaper than when you're an adult. If you want to learn how to draw once you're an adult and go to an art class, it's a lot more expensive than joining an art club. So yeah, try everything and take breaks from social. I say this as someone who's online a lot. Take breaks from social media. Go outside and touch grass. Like literally, we have scientific research now that shows that going and spending 20 minutes in nature a couple of times a week is fabulous for your mental health. And if you've got hay fever, go and spend 20 minutes on the beach or on a rocky cliff or something. But just try lots of different things.
Before I pull up one of the points about that, trying different subjects, I do think we need to remember that we over-commodify education too much, particularly that this will lead to a career, this will lead to this. I do think that detracts away from a lot of the value. But the other thing, more of a funny anecdote, I will say, as someone with hay fever, I was on a cruise ship, and somehow in the middle of the North Sea, where there was no pollen around, I was still suffering with hay fever. I have absolutely no idea how I drew that short straw, but that was more of a funny anecdote on hay fever. It can follow you wherever you go. But I'd be interested then, Liz, about, you spoke about it a bit with drama, but one of my questions was really around, is there a subject that you came back to in any way, shape, or form after dismissing it?
Well, I had to come, I had German at school, but I didn't speak any German when I left. And so moving to Germany definitely made me go back to German. I'm trying to get back into art now because I'm really aware of how useful having scientific art to back up science communication online is. And my artistic skills aren't great, but it is practice, practice, practice. Yeah, even Latin, like learning more Latin. And I wish that I'd actually seen it as valuable in school. Yeah, I'm sure there's going to be more that I come back to. I'm definitely sure that there are going to be things I'll be like, oh, I wish I kept that from, I don't know, sixth form or whatever. I will say that I always used to think that physics and maths was harder. But then when I did an interdisciplinary PhD, I was like, oh, biology is actually the hard one because physics works or it doesn't, mathematics works or it doesn't, chemistry works or you blow stuff up. But biology, you think you understand everything. You understand all of the environmental conditions, and then you put biology in and everything goes weird and we don't know why. So I think I undervalued biology. I don't think I abandoned it. I think I undervalued it.
As we're getting towards the end now, Liz, first question is a question for you to ask my other guest, the guest who's coming after you. What question would you ask them, whether they're a content educator, a researcher, or someone who is purely just starting out as a student? What would be your question?
Okay, I think for an educator or a scientist, not for someone starting out, what is the one lesson you wish you'd learnt earlier? So, for example, I wish I'd learned how to say no earlier.
Oh, really, really interesting question, and I'm sure that will be a powerful one for someone to answer. And the question that I have for my previous guest for you is, as a scholar, what is your preference, research or teaching? I think I already know the answer, but well, please, tell me more about why the preference, if that was the case.
Yeah, it's teaching. Research can be really isolating. And for me, I find research fascinating up to a certain level. And then I'm like, oh, I know enough about that and I want to move on. And when you are researching and you want to publish your papers, you need to keep going and become more and more focused. Whereas my interests go in the opposite direction. Plus, when you're teaching someone something, it really cements your own knowledge. Because if you don't understand it, you can't teach it.
I think that's a really good way of looking at it. And that, I will say, Liz, brings us just about nicely up to the end of this segment of Sitting Down with Scholars. And I would like to thank you very much for joining me on this episode and talking about your academic journey. Before I end, are there any platforms that my guests, if they want to find out more about what you do and your work, where they can find you on?
Yeah, so I'm online as the Guernsey Scientist, and you can find me on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, Blue Sky, LinkedIn. I'm not on Twitter for many reasons. I'm most active on TikTok, but I am around on all of those platforms. And I've got a Substack, which I have ignored. So I might start using that.
Well, hopefully when this episode goes live on Substack, that will give you potentially that justification to restart that. And I'm sure we'll see many different interesting either written pieces or video pieces from yourself on there. But thank you again, Liz, and thank you on behalf of my guests for joining us. And please join me on another episode where I'll be speaking to another scientist about their academic journey. And thank you again, Liz.
Thank you.